How one lock, one Karen, and one community changed everything. The moment Karen's red bolt cutters snapped through the reinforced padlock on my shed, the world shifted in a way that was almost cinematic, as if the movie was a thriller wrapped in absurd suburban tragedy. A crimson LED blinked alive above the door, casting her shocked face in hellish flashes. A mechanical voice sliced through the quiet like a guillotine. Containment breach detected. Within seconds, the deep, menacing hum of Homeland Security drones reverberated over the rooftops. I wasn't even home, just 15 minutes away buying mulch, but it didn't matter. Karen had decided that her clipboard gave her more authority than federal signage, biometric locks, and clearly marked warnings. She expected fertilizer or forbidden backyard chickens, maybe a reason to slap me with another HOA citation. What she got instead were sealed crates labeled training use only, DHS authorized, blinking control panels, and the cold stare of Otis. A deactivated bomb disposal unit stationed like a silent guardian. Her scream high-pitched, raw, like someone who had just stumbled into a horror film echoed through the neighborhood before she sprinted straight into my wife's prized rose bushes, tearing her hand open and face-planting into thorn petals. By the time I returned, my street was a war zone, barricades, agents in bomb suits, neighbors filming behind curtains. And at the center of it all, Karen, face pale and bloodied, trying desperately to explain how her role as HOA president entitled her to breach a federally monitored shed. They had cuffed me at first. Standard protocol until Agent Delgado, my former DHS team lead, spotted me. Unbelievable, she muttered, before ordering them to release me. Karen, still raving about domestic threats and neighborhood safety, didn't realize she had just committed a federal crime. The irony was crushing. I'd moved here for peace, retirement, a tomato garden, not a neighborhood dictator with delusions of grandeur and a vendetta against my perfectly legal shed. After the chaos of the shed breach, you'd think Karen would have retreated into whatever suburban void spawned her, but no. If anything, being the center of a federal lockdown only ignited her obsession. The very next week, she was back on her porch, arms crossed like a general surveying a battlefield, glaring across the lawn as if I were the one who had committed treason. Meanwhile, Agent Delgado and her team continued their investigation, and I was advised to keep a low profile while the paperwork cleared, and the legal implications against Karen began to stack like bricks in a cell wall. But even with a pending federal charge looming over her, Karen doubled down. She started a whisper campaign, handing out pamphlets disguised as neighborhood safety updates that were really just thinly veiled attacks against me, suspicious military activity, and unauthorized structures. Potential threats to community harmony. The gall of it was almost impressive, if not completely deranged. But what she didn't know, couldn't possibly know, was that Delgado's team wasn't just looking into the shed incident anymore. During a routine review of neighborhood security footage, thanks to the cameras I'd installed after Karen's first fence-peeking episode, they discovered something odd. A black SUV had been surveilling the neighborhood days before the shed break-in. It wasn't Homeland, and it wasn't local enforcement. Turns out, it was an unmarked vehicle from a separate federal task force conducting quiet surveillance for a different operation on that Karen unknowingly compromised when she triggered the containment alert. What Karen had actually done was bigger than anyone realized. Her act of heroism hadn't just set off my shed, it had disrupted a classified federal training maneuver that involved covert observation of a high-value asset in the area. Delgado pulled me aside, her voice grim. Her stunt didn't just get your shed breached. It blew an entire operation we'd spent months staging. She's not just a nuisance anymore, she's a liability on paper. And just like that, Karen wasn't just facing charges for trespassing and federal property damage. She was about to be tied to the collapse of a Homeland Security field op, and once that hit the legal system, even her beloved HOA couldn't shield her from the fallout. Still, she pranced around in her knockoff wedges, clipboard in hand, acting like nothing had happened, as if she could find her way out of federal prison. But I knew the truth. No, she hadn't just picked the wrong lock. She'd picked a fight with the wrong man, in the wrong neighborhood, at the exact wrong time. And the consequences were only just beginning. It wasn't long after the federal operation was compromised that the ripples of Karen's reckless behavior reached even deeper into the neighborhood and straight into Marcus's living room. Marcus was a quiet guy, ex-Navy cyber analyst turned freelance IT consultant, who had intentionally kept to himself ever since moving into blocks over. He had nothing to do with my shed, didn't even attend whole meetings. But Karen had decided that his existence was suspicious the moment he refused to join her community technology committee of vanity project she started after her containment breach hero narrative fell apart. After being told point-blank by Delgado that she was being investigated, Karen needed a new target, and Marcus became the next bullseye. One night, after noticing her Wi-Fi connection dropped, Karen marched into the police station and filed a report claiming Marcus had hacked her internet. The basis: he changed his router password, and apparently that was enough evidence of cyber terrorism in Karen's deranged world. So it didn't surprise anyone except Marcus when two uniformed officers showed up on his doorstep at midnight, flashlights in hand, and Karen standing smugly behind them like she'd just busted a cartel. "We've received a complaint of unauthorized hacking," one of them said, as if they didn't quite believe it themselves. Marcus blinked, still in pajama pants, before laughing out loud. "You're saying I hacked into her Wi-Fi? The Wi-Fi I paid for? In my house?" Karen, sunglasses on her head despite it being pitch black outside, pointed at him like a villain in a cheap courtroom drama. "I don't know how you did it, but you did. My son can't play his games, and it started the second you changed your password. That would have been laughable if not for what happened next." When the report hit the system, a red flag went up, not because of Marcus, but because Karen's son, Kyle, already had a digital footprint flagged by Homeland Security's Cyber Division. Turns out Kyle had been piggybacking off neighborhood networks to mask his identity while digging into restricted forums and accessing encrypted data vaults hosted overseas. Marcus's routine password change had accidentally cut off Kyle's access, and Karen, completely ignorant of her son's activities, had walked straight into the jaws of a federal cybercrime investigation. Within 24 hours, a sealed warrant had been issued. Marcus was cleared instantly and quietly looped into the investigation as a witness. Karen, meanwhile, woke the next morning to the sight of black vans lining her driveway and federal agents battering down her door. Her screams echoed down the street as agents dragged out boxes of hardware and a dazed Kyle, now in cuffs, muttering about VPNs and just being curious. I watched the whole thing unfold from my porch, coffee in hand. The woman who tried to frame her neighbor for a non-existent hack had just served her own son to the wolves, and it wasn't even the end. It was just another day in the neighborhood Karen built with paranoia and power trips, crumbling one FBI raid at a time. By the time the FBI carted Karen's son away in handcuffs and the headlines hit the local news, "Suburban hacker busted in HOS cyber scandal," the neighborhood was no longer just fed up, it was awake. The mask of control Karen had worn so proudly had finally shattered, and beneath it was nothing but chaos, delusion, and a trail of misused authority. What stunned most people wasn't the cybercrime or the shed incident, it was the sheer scale of her arrogance. Every resident she'd fined, every yard she'd criticized, every off-white curtain she'd condemned now saw her for what she was, a tyrant in a pencil skirt. And yet, the deeper the investigation went, the more rot they found. As federal agents combed through her HOA records, it became clear that Karen hadn't just micromanaged people, she had manipulated the system. Entire sections of the bylaws had been quietly rewritten with vague language that gave her unilateral control over certain emergency decisions. She'd approved spending without oversight, blocked board votes that questioned her authority, and, most damning of all, redirected thousands of dollars in community funds to personal projects, including a new deck on her property that had been billed as community observation infrastructure. It was Gina who stepped up. A former police officer turned single mom of 3, she'd kept her head down for years, raising her kids while Karen terrorized her with bogus noise complaints and passive-aggressive letters about child-related clutter. But when the board finally collapsed under the weight of federal scrutiny and resignation started pouring in, Gina stood up. She didn't ask permission. She didn't hold a vote. She simply walked into the next emergency whole meeting hosted in the community center, now dubbed the War Room by locals, and took the podium with a look that dared anyone to stop her. "This ends now," she said, voice steady, eyes like iron, and nobody said a word. With the old board dismantled and Karen suspended pending criminal trial, Gina led a full audit of the HOAS finances, bylaws, and internal communications. What they uncovered read like a Netflix drama: fake invoices, deleted emails, rigged citation systems, even forged community votes. It turned out that the new fountain Karen installed in the park had been built twice under landscaping and once under neighborhood morale enhancements. It wasn't just fraud. It was strategic chaos, wrapped in bureaucracy and hidden beneath layers of Ho jargon that made people too exhausted to fight back. But now, the fear was gone. Gina repealed every Karen-issued citation not backed by actual municipal code and called for a community-wide vote to restructure the Ho from the ground up. People who had never spoken at meetings stood up and shared their stories of harassment, threats, even public shaming over lawn decor. Rick, ever the neighborhood philosopher with his iced tea and cursing parrot, summed it up best. Turns out, freedom doesn't look like matching beige mailboxes. It looks like standing up when someone tells you to sit down and shut up. And just like that, the neighborhood began to breathe again. Once Gina officially took the reins of the whole, it was like the entire street exhaled for the first time in years. The cloud that had hung over the neighborhood, Kern's clipboard tyranny, her absurd citations, her paranoia-fueled vendetta shed finally lifted. But the relief didn't mean the work was over. What Karen left behind wasn't just a mess of forged documents and misused funds. It was a community that had been divided, silenced, and conditioned to fear the very group meant to represent them. Gina, with her no-nonsense cop instincts and mom of three efficiency, wasted no time cleaning house. She opened up all Ho records for public review, held town hall-style meetings in the community center, and invited every resident to speak without time limits or formal decorum. And speak they did. One by one, neighbors stood up and told stories that bordered on the surreal, like the retired librarian fined for planting lavender instead of Ho-approved boxwood, or the couple down the street forced to repaint their fence 3 times because Karen didn't like the undertones. But the biggest transformation came from what Gina did next. She called me, said she had an idea, something that could turn the shed, same one Karen had tried to weaponize into a symbol of resilience instead of fear. What if we made it a community safety hub? She asked. Use your DHS training gear as part of a public education effort. Teach people what this stuff is, demystify it, own the story. At first, I was skeptical. The shed wasn't a museum, it was part of a real federal contract. But after some calls to Delgado, who surprisingly loved the idea, we got the green light. We set up a scaled-down version of a bomb squad awareness exhibit, roped off mock devices, safety signage, walk-through stations, and, of course, Otis the robot, freshly cleaned and reintroduced as our honorary neighborhood mascot. The reaction blew me away. Families came in droves, kids wide-eyed, parents asking thoughtful questions. Even the local school board reached out about adding our setup to their emergency response curriculum. Every Saturday for 6 weeks, I found myself leading tours, explaining how containment sensors worked, how to identify suspicious items, and most importantly, how to respond without panic. Gina helped organize everything. Rick volunteered to man the snack booth. Even Mrs. Tran showed up with baked goods and gave Otis a wear-upon scarf for winter months. The community wasn't just healing, it was thriving. Where fear and silence once ruled, there was now laughter, curiosity, and unity. The same neighbors who once hid behind their curtains during Karen's reign were now collaborating on mural projects, potluck dinners, and late-night porch talks. The whole meeting stopped feeling like interrogations and started feeling like reunions. For the first time since I'd moved in, I wasn't just the guy with the shed. I was part of something bigger. And that all began the moment Karen lost her grip on a neighborhood that was never hers to control. As the weeks passed and the Safe Zone project took root in the community, something truly rare began to unfold on our once tension-choked block. Actual joy. People smiled more. They lingered outside longer. Kids played in yards that had once been silent under the weight of Karen's overbearing gaze. The Saturday safety sessions became the highlight of the week, with families bringing lawn chairs, homemade lemonade, and in one case, birthday cake for Otis, the robot who had somehow become both mascot and myth. What started as a DHS training shed had transformed into a symbol of resilience, of how a neighborhood once ruled by fear could rebuild itself not just with new rules, but with real connection. Gina, ever the pragmatic leader, even installed a chalkboard outside the community center where residents could write positive messages, post upcoming events, or leave notes of appreciation. The first message written, "This is our street now," and no one erased it. But not everyone found comfort in the transformation. Karen, long since ousted, was spiraling in the shadows. Her house sat cold and neglected, the yard unkempt, mailbox overflowing with an open letter, some likely from the Department of Justice. The community barely spoke of her anymore, and when they did, it was with the hushed tone usually reserved for ghost stories. Rumor had it her civil fines were piling up, and the DHS lawsuit for federal interference was moving through court like a freight train. Her reputation was ruined, her allies had fled, and her carefully curated persona of suburban perfection lay in ruins. But the final nail came not from the government, not from me, but from the community she once terrorized. At the next whole meeting, Gina announced that the whole board had voted to remove Karen's name from all community acknowledgments, records, and titles. It wasn't vindictive, it was surgical, a clean severance from the past. In her place, new voices rose. A young couple volunteered to organize the first neighborhood block fair in years. Mrs. Tran offered to teach Tai Chi in the park. Rick, of course, offered to bring Otis. And the guy with the once feared shed, was asked to give a short speech on safety and second chances. Standing there that Saturday evening, under string lights and the soft hum of a rented popcorn machine, I looked out over a crowd that had once lived under Karen's rule and now lived by their own terms. Faces once anxious were now alight with laughter and ease. Children wore Team Otis shirts. A makeshift mural hung behind the food stands, a cartoon version of the shed with Karen running away from a grinning robot. And the words, "Respect the lock." It was perfect. Not because it mocked her, but because it honored what we had become, a real community. Not because of the shed. Not even because of Karen, but in spite of her. The chaos she unleashed had sparked something greater, and for the first time since retiring, I felt home. It was the mural that finally made it real. The moment when I looked at the cartoonish shed, the exaggerated Otis with laser eyes chasing after a caricature of Karen in heels, and realized the neighborhood had done more than heal. It had evolved. What was once a tight-lipped, beige-on-beige suburb ruled by citations and fear had become a living, breathing community, full of color, laughter, and memory that didn't dwell in bitterness but bloomed into lessons. The mural wasn't mockery. It was a shared symbol, a story everyone had lived through and survived. The kids called it the Great Shed Saga, and honestly, that wasn't far off. But what happened next was even more unexpected. Delgado returned, not with a team, not in a black SUV, but with a casual smile and a DHS-branded duffel bag. "I brought something for the museum," she joked, nodding toward the shed. Inside was a framed photo. Karen caught mid-scream by the trail cam the moment she opened the door, with the blinking red alert light above her and Otis just visible in the background. Below it, a metal plaque read, "Curiosity detonated the Karen." I laughed until I couldn't breathe. It was cathartic, not cruel, just honest. A reminder of how entitlement and ego can implode under their own weight. I hung the photo above the tool rack in the shed, right where the old lock used to be. And every time I glanced at it, I remembered why the locks mattered, why the warnings were posted, and why authority should never be confused with power. Karen had thought rules were for other people, that her clipboard gave her dominion over common sense. What she got instead was a crash course in federal law and the reality that community means trust, not control. Her name faded from everything. The HOA's official records were cleansed, her bylaws repealed, her bogus fines invalidated. Even her property was flagged with code violations before it could sell ironic, considering she once fined someone for a non-regulation bird bath. She left quietly, slinking away like a defeated cartoon villain. No farewell notes, no grand speeches, just a moving truck and an overturned garden gnome. Rumor had it she tried to start over across town in a new community owned without an HOA, but her reputation followed her like a bad smell in a closed room. Screenshots of her infamous forum post, "I'll find out what that weirdo is hiding if it's the last thing I do," had already gone viral. Passed around like cautionary parables on neighborhood watch apps. No one trusted her, not anymore. Meanwhile, we thrived. Gina expanded the Safe Zone project, and the local school board made our shed an official field trip stop. Otis got a second paint job, this time with glittery flames down the side, and someone made a bumper sticker that read "Otis, Neighborhood Neutralizer." And me, I finally felt settled. Not just in my house, but in my home. A home that stood because one person fell and because an entire community finally stood up. By the time fall rolled around and leaves painted the sidewalks in gold and fire, Pan and Street didn't just feel different, it felt alive. The chaos Karen unleashed had become legend, the kind whispered over backyard fences and chuckled about at block parties. Her name became a unit of measurement. That's a 2.5 on the Karen scale, Rick would say anytime someone got a little too intense at a community meeting. But the memory no longer stung, it united us. The Saturday safety seminars had become a neighborhood tradition, with kids dragging their parents to see Otis like he was a Disney character. We even gave out "I survived the shed incident" stickers. What started as a reaction to chaos had transformed into a celebration of resilience. Then came the annual neighborhood block fair, first one in nearly a decade. Gina spearheaded it, of course, and made sure every resident had a role. She even convinced the local fire department to send a real bomb squad vehicle for display. When Otis rolled out beside it, freshly waxed and fitted with a custom body, the crowd erupted. Children wore matching t-shirts that read "Keep calm" and "Let Otis handle it," and someone even made little plush versions of him for the kids. The laughter, the unity, the lightness, it felt surreal after the year we'd had. Just before the talent show kicked off, Delgado pulled me aside again. She handed me a sleek black frame. Inside was a still from the trail camper in mid-screen, the red LED light flashing behind her and below it, a polished plaque, "Some doors are locked for a reason." I couldn't help but grin. I hung it next to the first photo in the shed, right above where Otis now stood on permanent display. The kids had even made him a little nameplate out of Legos. He wasn't just a robot anymore. He was a symbol, a beacon of reason, of boundaries, of what happens when curiosity lacks respect. Karen's downfall hadn't just cleansed the board of corruption. It had taught the whole neighborhood a lesson in humility and the power of unity. She tried to rule us with fear and fines. We rebuilt with trust and transparency. Gina's leadership solidified into something more than temporary. The whole charter was revised with community oversight, and a new rule was a dead no bylaw could pass without a 75% community vote. No more dictators with clipboards, no more secret meetings. And for the first time, the whole wasn't feared, it was respected. It became a support system instead of a surveillance state. People began proposing ideas instead of hiding from enforcement. Community gardens, after-school programs, even a small lending library next to the park. I helped build the shed for it. On quiet nights, I'd sit on my porch, watching families walk, kids racing scooters, parents weaving, Rick and his parrot yelling Spanish phrases at squirrels. And somewhere in the distance, the soft, mechanical whir of Otis turning his head toward the dusk. Peace didn't come with silence, it came with community. And we had finally found it. Winter arrived gently that year, as if the world itself understood Pan and Street had earned a little peace. The trees stood bare but proud, and the lights strung across porches twinkled with something more than holiday spirit, something deeper, like pride. It had been a full year since the shed incident, and though time had softened the edges of the chaos, the impact still pulsed through every corner of our block. What once had been a battleground of passive-aggressive lawn notes and hoa threats was now a living monument to the power of community. The neighborhood had become the kind of place I never believed truly existed, where people didn't just coexist, but genuinely looked out for each other. Gina's leadership had brought structure without suffocation. The new hoa didn't feel like a regime, it felt like a circle of neighbors doing their best. Rules were simple, clear, and backed by actual logic. No more curtain color fines, no more mailbox inspections. If you had a question, you asked. If you needed help, you got it. Even the old wounds had been transformed into symbols of strength. The mural behind the park benches had been updated for winter. Otis now wore a Santa hat, and the cartoon Karen had been replaced with a ghost of bad bylaws past, floating away into the sky with a clipboard trailing behind her like a forgotten relic. Someone had even added a speech bubble that said, "No more fines for wind chimes." It was absurd, it was hilarious, and it was us. The people who once whispered behind closed blinds now laughed openly in the streets. The Safe Zone shed remained a local treasure. Every month, new visitors came through, families, students, even a few city council members looking to replicate the model. Delgado herself showed up in early December to give a talk about responsible civic engagement, using Karen's incident as a case study in overreach. "Don't let your hole become a hammer looking for nails," she told a crowd of wide-eyed high schoolers. She later pulled me aside, handed me a DHS commendation plaque, and said, "For turning a neighborhood disaster into a national lesson." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded and placed it beside the framed photo of Karen's infamous scream. That wall inside the shed had become its own kind of museum, a timeline of transformation. And the neighborhood had changed, not just in spirit but in texture. Colorful mailboxes replaced the uniform beige. Little libraries popped up beside community benches. Fences were painted with murals instead of warnings. People shared tools, planted flowers together, held weekend cleanups without being told to. We didn't just recover, we rebuilt. Not because we had to, but because we wanted to. We remembered what it felt like to be silenced. So now we made sure no one else ever had to be. As snow began to fall that evening, light and slow, I stood on my porch, coffee in hand, watching the street glow with warmth. A neighborhood reborn, it with noise or rebellion, but with laughter, color, and quiet strength. And somewhere behind me, Otis blinked once, calm and content. Valuable lesson. True authority isn't about control, it's about responsibility, respect, and service. Karen's downfall is a powerful reminder that leadership without humility becomes tyranny, and rules enforced without empathy become weapons. In contrast, when a community unites with transparency, compassion, and shared purpose, it can not only survive calls, it can thrive beyond it. The transformation of Penn Street shows us that even the most fractured neighborhoods can rebuild stronger, not by erasing the past, but by learning from it. It teaches us to speak up against overreach, to stand together when fairness is threatened, and to remember that the quiet strength of everyday people is more powerful than any clipboard or title. In the end, resilience, not revenge, is what creates lasting peace.